Hi, I'm Gary Stewart with Stewart Teamwork Solutions. In this episode of SharePoint Basic Training, we'll be talking about SharePoint site columns. The material we'll be covering today is very basic SharePoint functionality and is targeted towards newer users of SharePoint. Before we dive into our discussion of site columns, let's lay some groundwork. One of the fundamental components of any SharePoint site is the list application. A list contains items, and each item within a list can contain various bits of data. The data for each item is stored in columns or data fields. So that's where columns come into play in SharePoint. Now there are basically two kinds of columns that you can create in SharePoint. First is a list column, and that's a column specific to a list or library. And the second is a site column, which is what we want to talk about later. But site columns are not assigned to any specific list or associated with any specific list or library and can be reused among more than one list or library. To illustrate the use of list columns, let's start by creating a new list in our site. Simply click on the tile for adding lists and allow SharePoint to come up. In this case, let's create a custom list. And for our example, let's say we want to create an employees list. So employees, we've already got that there. Hit create and let SharePoint create the list for you. And that didn't take very long. And here we have our new employees list just created. Let's take a look at that before we modify it. So here you see, here's our employees list. It contains one column at this point, the title column, which is a default column added to any new custom list. And we want to add some other items to this list, some other columns to this list. So let's modify the list settings by clicking in the ribbon up here on list settings. And now you can see here's our settings for our new employees list. And if you look down in this section, here are the columns that it currently contains. You can see it contains title, as well as some other columns that we didn't see in that view, which were added automatically. Now, for our purposes, let's say we want to add an employee name to our list. So we simply create a new column. We'll call it name. All right. In this case, we'll go a single line of text, and we'll allow the other default values to be what they are. Hit OK. And SharePoint will create that column for us. Might take a few seconds. And there we are. You can see we've got a name column now. Title column, we'll use that column, but we don't want it to be required. That'll be the position title. So simply click on title, come down here and change this option to no. We will not require the column to contain information, and hit OK. And finally, let's add another list column for business units. We want to know what business unit the employee is assigned to. So we'll call it business unit. In this case, we want to select from a choice, a predefined choice. So we click on choice. And down here, you can see we've got a new field to fill out. And this contains a listing of the choices that we want to provide. So we'll say BU1, BU2, and BU3. Would like to display those choices on a drop-down menu, so we'll leave that as is. We don't want to allow fill-in choices, and for a default value, we don't want any default value. That all looks good. Let's hit OK. And there you have it. We've got the title column, we've got the name column, and we've got a business unit column. These are all list columns associated just with this employees list. So let's take a look at the list itself. And here you see title, name, business unit, as we said before. If we add a new item to that, just click on the new item link there. Give SharePoint a second to think about it. And let's add in admin assistant. Name is Joe Smith. And Joe is in business unit 2. Save. And there you have it. Here's our list with our first item entered into the list and with our data for that item contained in these columns. And these again are list columns that are specific to this list. Next we'll show how you could use site columns that would enable you to basically reuse a column, say business unit column, for another list without going through the process of recreating the business unit column for each list that you create. So we'll look at that next. Okay, so here we are back at our site, and we've just gone through the process of creating an employees list that contains several custom list columns. Now say for example you wanted to create another list, or maybe more than one list, and you wanted to, within that list, use that business unit column so that you could assign those items to the business units within each list. So for example, you might have a computer inventory list, and you want to be able to say this machine resides or is assigned to this business unit. Or you might want to redo your employees list to use a site column. So let's start with this. Let's take our employees list and get rid of the one we created. So go to site contents. This was our original employees list. Let's remove that. Don't need that anymore. Say OK. Now let's go to back home and let's think about this. We want to create a site column for business units so that we can reuse that column in different lists. So let's go to do that. Let's go to site settings. Do that by clicking on the gear icon. Go to site settings. And from here you can see under web designer galleries there's a site column section. So let's click on site columns. And for this, you can see when you go to this page that SharePoint has a lot of built-in site columns already that can be used in your custom lists if you'd like to, but they don't have one for business units. So let's create a site column for business units. Click on the create link. Let's type business units in again, or business unit rather. Again, it's going to be a choice. This looks very much like the screen we saw when we were creating a list column, but there are some differences. Here we've got group. Put the site column. This is a group or a column that you're creating, so it wants to know where you'd like to store that. In this case, suggesting custom columns. We'll go ahead and use that. Same choices that you saw before in this area. And let's put our business units here in the selection or in this field. So there'd be U1, 2, and 3. Again, drop down, no fill in, no default. Get rid of our default. Click OK. So if we scroll down to the custom columns section, you can see we've now got business unit as a field for, or as a column rather, that we can use. That's great. So let's go back home to the home page in the site, and let's add a list again. And since we got rid of our old employees list, let's recreate that. So custom list, let's type employees, create, and let's go to the settings for that list. You can do that by clicking on the ellipses and then clicking settings in the pop-up menu. Again, very much like we saw before. In this case, we'll add the name just like we did before, creating a list column. So name, allow everything else to default, hit OK. But now we want to add business units. So instead of requiring us to go through and create that business unit column again, we can just say add from existing site columns. And you pull that up, go to your custom group, because that's where we stored the business unit column, and you can see it's right there. So add that, hit OK. Once again, we'll change title so that it's not required. By doing that, hit OK. And we should be back to where we were. But you can see that the creation of the list was much easier because we didn't have to go through and set up the business unit. So new item, you can see the same fields that we had before. Now, if you're only creating a column that's going to be used in one list and never reused anywhere else, then it may not make sense to use a site column. But in our case, let's say we want to create another list for laptops. So we'll go here, again, add a new list, add a new custom list. Let's call it laptop inventory. Create that. And here we have our new list for laptops. Let's go to the settings for that list. Again, title, that's one of the default fields that are added. We're not going to have that be required, so let's fix that. Let's add a list column, laptop number or laptop code, single line of text, go with the default columns on that, or the default fields on that rather. And then we want to know what business unit that laptop belongs to, so we'll add from existing site columns. And you can see we just select from custom again, select business unit, add it, okay. Okay, there we go. So now you can see we've got title, we've got laptop number, we've got business unit. We didn't have to go through and set up the business unit column again. It was already set up as a site column. Made it very easy to add to this list. Can save you a lot of time if you have a column that you need to reuse over and over again. If we go back to laptop inventory, title, laptop number, business unit, new item, and you can see it's there. So that's one of the advantages of site columns, is that you can reuse them. And that maintains consistency because, you know, we've got the business units defined in that site column. We're not setting up site columns, or we're not setting up list columns every time we create a list, which could introduce the possibility of putting in a wrong business unit name. So it allows for standardization of the information, makes list setup much easier. And there's some other advantages of site columns we'll talk about in another episode, and that's their use in creating content types. But for now, that's it for site columns. Hope you've learned something, and you can always check out my website, www.stsonpoint.com, for other helpful tips and training.